Stories have beginnings and endings, and games work in cycles. That's why you have storylines and gameplay loops. But what happens if you have a story loop? Like a kid telling you about his dream, is a story still a story when it has no beginning and no end? Or is it just noise? If the story is a circle, does it have a point? Returnal is fuck. Returnal is a third-person... God damn it. Returnal is a third-person roguelite action game developed by Housemarque and released in 2021 for the PlayStation 5 and PC in 2023. Housemarque is a Finnish studio that has been around for over 30 years, quietly building excellent games that I passed by on my rush to something AAA. Looking through their back catalog, I can say with certainty that I probably got a few of those in a humble bundle and never played them. Which sounds like an insult, but really, it's me who is failing them. There are so many great games out there, and I simply am not keeping up. Maybe you feel the same, and maybe one such game is Returnal. Depending on which shadowy corners of the internet you choose to hide in, you may have heard of it as a hidden gem of the now 6-year-old next generation, woefully underappreciated for its tight gameplay and slick presentation. In other corners, you might hear that it's brutally difficult, terribly repetitive, and that the narrative is disappointing. Well, much like fan theories, all of these things can be true. The game opens with a bang, or maybe a crash. Celine is a scout for a human interplanetary group called Astra, and she's gone rogue chasing after an alien signal that asks, "Do you see the white shadow?" and followed it to its source on a planet named Atropos. We first see her in her ship, the Helios, hurtling towards the ground the way I hurtle towards a Chinese buffet. The Helios is smashed, but she awakens unharmed and crawls out of the wreckage to a world that desperately wants to fix that. Pushing through alien vines under the boughs of massive trees, the world of Atropos is at once both incredibly hostile and strangely comforting. In the game's early hours, I found myself fondly reminded of my time huddled next to my little purple GameCube, ankle deep from the top down in the first Metroid Prime. I haven't felt so isolated on an alien world in years, slowly chipping away at a mystery where each bit of revelation brings with it 2 new questions.
I'm nearly at Broadcast Tower, but I haven't seen any evidence of any living member of the hive mind. If they sent out White Shadow, when? The mothership first picked up the transmission months back. Mathematically, that means it was triggered ages ago. Thousands of years before I was born.
Its aesthetic leans almost into horror, with a strong emphasis on the terrors of the deep ocean evident across the strange, tentacled beasts and the grasping vines that flow up from the ground and down from the ruins of an ancient civilization. And look, I'll be the first person to call out a hardware gimmick for what it is, but when I realized that the haptic feedback on the PS5 controller was the little thuds of the rain hitting my suit, I had to stop and breathe it in for a minute. It was very immersive. It worked. It wasn't necessary, and it certainly isn't worth $80 a controller, but it worked. While you're exploring, it doesn't take long to come across a very familiar form.
Scout log, Atropos. I have found a deceased Astra Scout here. Checking identification on helmet. It's...
Nearby lays a weapon to drive home that something is very wrong here.
my sidearm.
There's this little bit of extra existential dread in the knowledge that you died here. Even if it wasn't you as the player who controlled that character when they died, when you walk into a room and one of the dog monsters is eating a corpse, it's Celine that's being eaten. a previous iteration of herself that makes it so much more personal and affecting than it would be if it was just some faceless NPC getting gummed on by a zombie. And that's good, but Selena's tough. If you really want to affect her on a personal level, you've got to hit her where she lives. Standing in the deepest reaches of the first biome is a mundane structure that looms more ominously than any other on this violent alien world.
That can't be here.
It's her home. Stepping through the front door, the camera changes to a first-person perspective, and we see small snippets of the life she left behind on Earth. But there's always this building sense of tension when you're in this space. You can't use your weapons anymore, so it's not the same kind of stress that you get in the moment-to-moment combat out in the open world. This is a slow, creeping dread, wondering what's around the corner or down those dark stairs. As you move from room to room, the house changes slightly. Lights will turn off on their own, and you always feel like there's something about to jump out at you. Celine's breath fogs up the dome of the helmet in front of your eyes, and you can feel her anxiety as you explore her past. The game isn't shy about throwing these loose threads in front of you that you have no ability to parse or interact with, both narratively and mechanically. Walls of vines, grapple points, colored energy barriers, and deep water all serve as hints that there's more waiting for you to explore when you come back through. And for better or worse, if you want to play Returnal, chances are that you'll be coming back through over and over and over as you fight for every inch of progress. So let's talk about the combat. It's good. I've got a long history of enjoying Soul Kiro Eldenborns and a short history of enjoying the occasional bullet hell. I've put enough time into roguelikes and roguelites to argue about the difference, and I'm old enough to know that they don't really matter. And my reflexes and patience are thinning more than my hair, so when I tell you it's good, I mean that it's both challenging and reasonably fair with some caveats. For the sake of full disclosure, I bought Returnal not long after it came out and gave it maybe 5 runs before I put it down. I liked what it was doing, but I only made it to the first boss once, and of course I lost. Waking up back at the Helios, I couldn't justify losing so much time in each loop, so I decided to save it for a day when my life was a little less stressful. Several years after putting the game down, I picked it back up wanting to see if it was as hard as I remember, and I'm not sure if there was some kind of balance patch, but it wasn't. I breezed through the first half of the game. I beat all of the bosses except the second one the first time I saw them, and that second boss, which is commonly said to be the hardest in the game, went down on the second attempt. But to reiterate, I'm not particularly great at games. There is a 0% chance that I could beat you at any given fighting game you could pick. I avoid competitive multiplayer because I don't find it enjoyable to lose the vast majority of the time, and even in games like Dark Souls, my typical strategy is just to keep hitting the wall until the wall gives up or I get lucky. But Returnal's combat is so slick and worked so well that I found myself easily sliding into that flow state, eyes in the middle distance, watching the incoming bullets in my periphery. One major factor in hitting that flow state is that all of the weapons have a generous amount of aim assistance, so as long as whatever you're fighting is vaguely in front of you, you'll probably be hitting it. Instead of precision targeting, spatial awareness is going to be the name of the game. Actually, the name of the game is Returnal, but I hoped you knew that by this point. The game offers you these handy little indicators when attacks are coming at you from off-screen, and your jump and dodge give you a fair amount of mobility to deal with most problems. Enemies create a lot of confetti, but if you're able to stay calm and you can guess the trajectory of the average basketball shot, you'll probably be fine. That's not to say that the game won't kill you, but it's no Ikaruga, and the skill ceiling isn't so terribly high that you can't possibly win without some magical RNG. You start each run with a handgun, but you can find a decent pile of weapons laying around in chests, suit artifacts to give you boost, parasites that come with buffs and drawbacks, and before the first boss you should find the ability to melee attack. Most of these are lost when you die and the level reshuffles a bit, but beyond those things, the rogue influences on this game are pretty limited. The ruins you travel through are often so similar that the reshuffling between levels is meaningless. And there are only a few different environments in total, and you cannot change the order that you go through them in, so it's not like you're going to come across a new hazard on your next run. It's just the same bowl of cereal in a slightly different order of spoonage. Different artifacts and parasites can have some effect on your playstyle, but weapons are so generously sprinkled throughout the levels that if you have a certain type you prefer, it's basically guaranteed that you will find some version of that weapon if you look around, even if it doesn't have the exact bonus effects that you would like. But those bonus effects are similar enough that they aren't going to change your playstyle anyway. There's not an assault rifle with a side effect that makes you better at melee or gives you a second dodge, but maybe you'd like your bullets to do damage over time or give you a little bit of health back when they hit an enemy or shoot homing missiles. They have different flavors, but they're all generally positive. Melee is effective and builds a lot of stagger, and enemies typically only have 2 or 3 different attacks to worry about, including the bosses, though their attacks will change between phases, of which each boss has 3 with their own health bars. All of that is to say that there aren't a ton of variables to worry about at any given time. Your biggest threat is going to be falling off a cliff or getting stuck with your back in a corner and not having enough room to dodge. That's a lot more detail than I would typically go into in one of these videos on a combat system, but I wanted to give you that information because Returnal has such a reputation for brutal difficulty, and I don't think that's entirely accurate. You have the tools necessary to overcome the game's challenges in almost every situation if you keep calm, and the moment-to-moment gameplay in Returnal is not crushingly difficult with a few exceptions. You aren't timing your parry windows to animation frames or whatever. You're dashing through a wall of slow-moving beach balls while you hold the right trigger and look vaguely in the direction of your enemies. There are 2 problems though. One is that the weapons are not very well balanced, and what was once a tense edge-of-my-seat gauntlet with one gun will be a cool saunter through the flowers with another. You may notice that most of my gameplay clips are using the same few weapons, and that is called a foo strategy. The second problem is that dying in Returnal is incredibly punishing. The splitting of that hair between difficulty and punishing may feel like a distinction without a difference, but it does matter. For me, roguelikes are most enjoyable when the loops are quick. Dying to a bad dodge or an attack pattern that I haven't seen before can be frustrating, but that sting is a lot less if I'm only 10 minutes into a run. But like the proportions of the average 15-year-old anime girl, Returnal's loops are ridiculously exaggerated, often taking 45 minutes or more in a single zone when you're starting out, and it can be very disheartening to lose that much time and start all over because you dodged off a cliff or didn't know what would happen when you laid down on the pain bed. When Celine dies in the game, you feel a little bit of her confusion and despair. You're both trapped in the loop, suffering together.
Helios! Astra, this is Celine. I survived the... Can you hear me? I'm in my ship. Suit status operational and... I've already experienced this before.
Time is a flat circle, and most roguelikes have a similar level of depth. The vast majority feel like they're using roguishness as a tool to stretch 15 minutes of gameplay past the 2-hour refund window without having to build a bunch of new enemies and environments. And there was a point early on in Returnal where I felt kind of that way about it. Since the areas feel so similar and you can only go through them in the same order and the bosses never change, the only real difference is the audio logs that you find. The game might as well be a linear experience, right? Well, over time, my perspective did change. There's a very different metatextual relationship between the loop and the player's character that's really unique in Returnal. If a roguelike addresses its loop at all, it's usually as set dressing. Characters in Spelunky or The Gungeon will acknowledge that the levels change between runs or that when they die they just wake up again, but it doesn't really matter. Those are just the things that need to happen to keep playing the game. In Hades, the main character knows that he's immortal, and every time he dies he just starts over. He is aware of that happening and he is an active participant in that loop. He is the one making it happen. The other NPCs remark on his progress and how he died each time. But in Returnal, Celine is both aware that she is in a time loop and does not know why, and is actively seeking to escape it.
It is impossible to escape. I have tried everything. I'm always brought back by... There is a moment between death and rebirth when tentacles drag me down. Screaming, drowning, returning.
And this is a very different tone to put into this concept where, for a player, dying and restarting is an annoyance, but for the character, it's torturous, and she's slowly going insane. She sees dead versions of herself and hears her own voice slowly descending into madness, rambling nonsense, crying in despair.
One of my corpses was still functioning. It attacked me and I killed myself. I need to believe it was nothing different than the other hostiles I dispatched, but was it? Or was it another version of me just trying to escape?
Are these future versions of herself, or are these versions of her own past where something so traumatic happened that she even forgot her own insanity? Has she been in this loop so long that she forgot she was in it and it just starts over forever? It's a compelling setup because in other roguelikes, the loop is another chance to succeed. But for Celine, every loop is another failure to escape. Also in those other games, the narrative conforms to the game's mechanics. And I don't mean that as an insult. I love Binding of Isaac and The Gungeon and Spelunky and yada yada yada. Those stories work fine, but it feels like the intention was to make a roguelike game and thread a story through it. Returnal feels like the inverse of that operation. Like the team wanted to make a time loop narrative and the structure of a roguelite was just the best fit for that. Following that line of thought, I can understand why those roguelike elements don't feel as fully utilized as they otherwise might. The loop is simple. You start at the Helios, fight and explore through the world and face a boss. When you defeat that boss, you unlock the next area and you do it again. If and when you die after beating that first boss, the gate to the next area stays open on all future loops, so you don't have to fight them again, though you can if you want some extra loot. You do have to find the gate in its new random location on the next run, but it lets you avoid some of the repetition. All things considered, it's a fairly kind design since most games like this would require you to face each boss on your way back through, attempting to progress the story. Speaking of that story, now is the time to jump out of the video if you want to avoid spoilers. Normally, I would try to give you a time code of a place that you could jump back in to get some final thoughts and conclusions on the game that would still not go into the specifics of the story, but that won't happen with this game. You've heard my thoughts on how it plays, and for the vast majority of players, I think that's going to be the part that matters, and the source of whatever satisfaction that you find in this game. That's a gentle way of saying, I don't recommend you play it for the story. After pushing through the swamps and climbing to the peak of the mountain and then going further still to massive towers that scrape the sky, we find the source of that white shadow broadcast and fight something out of Devil May Cry. He's a hell of a spectacle. Victorious, we awaken and finally make the connection with the mother ship, Astra. Our distress signal is heard, and Celine collapses to wait for rescue. She's finally free.
White Shadow. You were how I escape.
can't be here. I escaped. I was... Helios, you're still here too. Astra, is anyone listening? It's Celine. We're both trapped.
63 years later, Celine awakens in front of the Helios again, but the world has changed. Somehow, on Atropos, time has passed differently. You are no longer going through the same areas from the first loop, and with that change comes new enemies, weapons, and rooms. And that's great because by this point you've probably gotten really sick of going through the first environment over and over to get to the second and the third, but the problem is that the game is also now much harder. I mentioned earlier that you have the tools necessary to overcome the game's challenges, and while that is still true, in this fourth area, the game is no longer playing nice. If the first 3 biomes were a steady increase in difficulty, the fourth is compound interest from a payday lender. The levels are filled with bottomless pits and almost all of the enemies now fly. They're much faster and they suicide bomb you when they get close to death. Those that don't will often have shields that can only be broken with melee or a special alternate fire. And there are turrets everywhere, and of course, because you're starting the loop again, you don't have your fancy weapons and suit upgrades anymore. In many ways, the second half of the game can feel much more demoralizing than the first, which is thematically appropriate and mirrors what Celine is going through. After thinking I had made it out, that I succeeded, starting over again hurts. Celine says it too.
How did I keep going before?
Every time you wake up back at the bottom of the cliff, it's harder to start climbing again. And every time you beat a new boss and you make it a little further and you feel like you've accomplished something, there's always another corpse of your past self waiting for you, reminding you that that accomplishment was meaningless. Some version of you already got here before, only to die on the next step, and you haven't won anything. After you defeat the fourth boss, you might feel like you've got your feet back under you, and you'll step into a frozen wasteland so brutal it not only killed Celine, but nearly killed all of my enthusiasm for the game as well. If the fourth area was compound interest of difficulty, the fifth biome is an American hospital bill worth of pain. For comparison, when I finished the third boss fight and started the fourth area, I had died 7 times on that save. I died 5 more times in the fourth area for a total of 12 runs just to get to the fifth zone. And I died 19 more times in the fifth zone alone. Even through the difficulty spike in the fourth zone, I was fully in the Returnal is an underappreciated gem camp. But long before I saw the sixth biome, I was ready to walk away from the game entirely. It was miserable. What finally broke the dam was that after crashing like a wave against those icy stones 18 times, I found a Reddit post telling another struggler to use a specific weapon, which is never a good sign. It was called the Electro-Pylon Driver. I had picked it up before, but I quickly dismissed it because I didn't understand that beyond working as a tripwire, it also does massive stacking damage over time when you shoot the stakes directly into your enemies, and this lets you focus exclusively on dodging. I died once more to sloppy play and RNG, but even as I left my personal Tartarus behind, it hurt all the more to learn that there was no boss in the fifth area. Every bit of that difficulty came from the normal enemies, and by simply picking up a different weapon, I never had to struggle with the game again. I finished the sixth and final zone on my second try, and as the deformed titan that wore my own face sank into the abyss, I followed it to find a car and a cutscene.
brought me here? Is this what you wanted me to see?
Mom? Do you see the white shadow?
Do you see the white shadow?
What I didn't find was answers. Confused, I took back to the internet and found that there was a second ending. A true ending that can only be seen after finishing the game once. It can be found by playing through all of the areas in the game again and collecting a special item hidden in each zone. Thankfully, you don't have to defeat the bosses again. You can just run through, surviving as best as you can until you had them all, and then return to the house one last time to fire the shot that causes the Helios to crash in the first place. Finally, we go into the basement, get a car key, and then defeat the final boss once more to finally see the true ending and get those answers that I've been chasing since the game started.
Helios.
Oh, I don't like what I'm seeing here, but maybe I'm just missing something. Let's see, Helios is your ship, but it's also maybe the name of your kid, and your kid was in the car and you crashed, and your mom was an astronaut, but she was paralyzed, and maybe in another car crash, and you escaped the crash with your kid, but you couldn't save Helios. But there's a news story about the kid escaping the crash unharmed. Maybe that's the one Celine was in with her mom, and sometimes in the house you are the kid, so maybe you're playing as yourself and your mom was the astronaut. And okay, not only is nothing really explained, a lot of what I thought was happening seems to contradict itself. I could give you my own theory of what's going on in the game, but first, there's this talk given by one of the game's developers.
Eevi Korhonen.
I'll link it in the description. It's actually a really interesting deep dive into how Returnal built and presented its world and story, but I'll just give you the sections that matter for what I'm talking about here rather than trying to paraphrase it, because I don't want to put my own biases onto what she's saying.
But yeah, so back to kind of like what we wanted to achieve with the story. And this came from Harry Kruger, our creative director. Kind of like his vision for the story was to aim to haunt the player. And what he meant with that was that kind of like long after the credits have rolled on this game, the game would still be on your mind and you'd be wondering, what did that all mean? And that players would have different theories, and they would go online and they would kind of like fight on forums and on YouTube like, this is the definitive story of Returnal. And that, you know, we wanted to kind of like support that experience of kind of like there not being one definite answer to any of this. And we also kind of wanted to make sure that there was these gaps that players could fill in with their imagination. And I've personally really enjoyed like listening and reading what kind of theories players have about the story, because they're way better than what I could have, like, if there was one definitive answer. Kind of like if there had been one definitive story and we would have only supported that in the storytelling, I think it wouldn't have been half as good as some of the stuff that I've been reading. So I'm really, really all for kind of like this very interpretative version of the story, that there are multiple interpretations and we let the players decide what they want to believe. But yeah, so one thing that Harry was adamant was that there would be no agreed upon story. So not even internally. Like, we did create a version of events, and then like I did created a timeline of like these events happen and then these events happen and then these events happen. But that was just kind of like agreed that this is a version. And now that we've been talking internally with my team about the story, we still find sometimes we're like, no, I thought, like, I interpreted so that Celine was doing this, and so we're still internally like at odds sometimes about what the story means. But it's great because we get to then take those opinions and make sure that the kind of like game continues to be as weird and as open to interpretation as possible.
Okay, there was a very frustrated rant in here that I decided to take out in editing because it's not the vibe I like to maintain for the channel, but I am disappointed that this was the path Housemarque went with for this game's story. As a player and sometimes critic, it can be difficult to bridge the gap between what I wanted out of a game and the kind of game the developer wanted to create, and this is one of those times. If they wanted to make a game with no clear story, that is a choice, but I really, really wish that they would have just told me the version they made internally before adding all the unreliable narrator stuff. I guess it's just not the kind of story that I thought I was signing up for, and it wouldn't even matter except that aside from some balance issues, everything else about the game is so damn good, including the way its story is presented. All I needed was for the true ending to bring things together a little more concretely. I don't need my hand to be held while an author spoon feeds me the story. I like putting the pieces together myself, but when you're out there in the narrative desert digging up those holes, you got to go dig those holes. The core motivator is to know that somewhere under these miles of fucking dirt is a chest full of treasure. I have spent over 20 hours of my life now invested in the mystery that your game creates under the illusion that I was searching for resolution. If that resolution is that Celine is stuck in a time loop, or it was all a dream, or she's in hell, that's all fine. I don't have to like it, but come on, don't just throw up your hands and say, yes, all of those things can be true. And wasn't it fun digging all of those holes? No. Maybe for some people it is, but for me, no. I've seen comments about how Returnal deserves so much more retention, and I guess I can see that, especially if you're a gamer who engages with experiences more mechanically or enjoys edging. But it's a hard recommend for me as someone who loves games largely for the stories they tell and the catharsis of a well-done narrative climax. After all this time, trapped in a room with that kid telling me about his dream, I can confirm that for me, it just feels like noise. Hey, it's the after the video part. Sorry if that one was a bit of a downer. I don't know if any other game has done a 180-degree turn on my enjoyment quite as violently as Returnal did. The original version of this script was like 10,000 words, and you could really trace my descent from love to disappointment as my playthrough progressed. The sequel to Returnal, Saros, will probably be available before this video even comes out, and hopefully they'll put a more concrete narrative into that one. It could be a real masterpiece if so, because I still really like the gameplay, with the exception of some balance issues. Anyway, the next video should be Mega Man Legends. I've been working on a series retrospective of those for months, but it just keeps spiraling out of control. Every time I look away, the script gets longer. I genuinely cannot wait to be done with it so I can get back to smaller reviews. I do not have the time or attention span for these bigger projects. But until then, take care of yourself, and as always, thanks for watching. Later.
I know these recorded logs will be psych-evaluated, but that isn't why I'm hesitant to return to my life. The idea of waking up to routine, gym, coffee, books, interacting with people, sleeping, rarely dreaming. It sounds so alien now.
She sounds like she's losing focus.